we'd left off at the end of the parsha, where due to the Jews complaining, it says when Moshe Rabbeinu originally had come and he presented the three miracles to indicate that he is the Redeemer of Israel, it says Vayamenom. The people believed. The moment they believed, there was a work stoppage. Paro says to his courtiers and gives out the word that until now we've supplied the straw. There was a straw subsidy given by the government to make the bricks. From now on, we don't give the straw. They have to gather those straw. We're going to demand the same quotas. And if not, we're going to beat them. And they can be held accountable. So there was a contingent of the Zakanim who had come to Paro to complain. He says, we're not going to survive this. He says, you will survive it. Because the only reason why you have time to think and you're complaining is because you laid back, because you have time to think about other things. You have to be fully occupied in your work, and you be focused on your work. You won't complain. And therefore, from now on, we'll demand the same quota, and you have to gather your own bricks. That's what Paro said to them. Moshe and Aaron are going into Paro, and they meet this group. Two of them say, it's not clear from the pasuk, they say to Moshe that since you've come, we've become putrefied in the eyes of Paro. Yishbar Hashem beini v'nechem. God should judge you for what you did to us. Okay? Rashi cites the Midrash. Who are these two people who made this comment to Moshe and Aaron? This is Dustin Aviram. The ones who originally had informed on Moshe, these two were the antagonists of Moshe, and whatever they could in any way undermine, and they could not tolerate his existence from the very beginning, and now especially that he's coming back as the Redeemer, they said, this is redemption, things have gotten worse, God should judge you. Immediately when he hears that, he comes to Hashem, and he says, why have you made it so difficult for the people? You sent me as the Goel, as the Redeemer. Things were supposed to get easier. And since I've come, things have become more difficult. So Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, it's none of your business. So he says, if it's none of my business, I don't understand. So why did you send me? So Hashem says to Moshe, Ato tireh. Now you will see how I will take the Jews out of Egypt. So the inference of Ato now, Rashi said, cites the Midrash, this redemption from Egypt you're going to see, but because you asked the question, you will not see them coming into Eretz Yisrael. You will not merit to take the Jews into the promised land. This redemption you will see, the future we will not see. You will pass away and you will not go in. This is what Hashem said to him, because of these inappropriate statement that Moshe had said. Now, what was considered, if Moshe Rabbeinu was asking God, could you please explain it? If this is supposed to be redemption, it doesn't seem to be redemption. Things have gotten worse. Hashem says, right now, that's not your concern. But asking that question wasn't the tone of the question. It's inappropriate question. It's considered a lack of faith. Hashem says, if I will explain it, I will explain it. When Avram said, B'mo'ida ki risheno, how do I know if I'm going to inherit the land? God says, the land is yours. The land is yours. Right away, Avram says, but what happens if God says, I'm giving the land to you and your progeny and future generations, no strings attached. He didn't mention anything. It's contingent on anything. So that Avram had brought up the question, but how do I know what happens if the Jews somehow mess up in the future and they don't meet the grade? What's going to be? Hashem says that question should have been asked now. That at his level, that was a lack of faith. Moshe Rabbeinu, at this point, he says, you'll be the Redeemer, just follow my instruction, it's going to work out. When I'm ready to explain it to you, I'll explain it to you. And we'll see in a moment. Because at this point, Moshe Rabbeinu already had an understanding, especially we said earlier, that Hashem revealed to him certain names of Hashem, which through that he could perform revealed miracles, which even the Ovos HaKadoshim, the holy patriarchs, did not know. And therefore, he says, what you understand, they didn't understand. I made them promises. The promises never came to fruition. And they never asked me questions. And you, where I revealed to you so much, you ask me this kind of question. We'll see this. Woe to me that we've lost those individuals who used to exist, don't exist any longer. We don't find those kinds of people. And Rashi will cite psukim. The promise was made, and it was never fulfilled. But they never asked the question. You, where I've showed you so much, you asked this question. Therefore, it was a claim against Moshe Rabbeinu, and that's why he forfeited going into the land. And that's why this pasuk begins, V'yidaber Elokim al Moshe. First, the dibur is a much more formal type of speech, and Elokim is midas adim. Moshe is speaking very sternly to Moshe Rabbeinu because of what he had said, and God treated him too gently. As a result of that, he felt he had a right to ask a question, but he had no right to ask the question. When people get too comfortable and too chummy, they believe they have certain rights. Moshe didn't have that right. Although God revealed him and interacted with him differently, interacted with the Ovos HaKadoshim. Didn't make a difference. We'll see. V'yidaber Elokim el Moshe. Elokim spoke to Moshe. Dibur. Doesn't say V'yomer Hashem el Moshe. Dibur is what? Is formal speech. Elokim spoke to Moshe. V'yomer Elov Ani Hashem. I'm Hashem. Meaning, the way the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains it, you see this, the way I'm dealing, that things have gotten worse rather than better, you see that as the attribute of justice, just to the opposite. Ani Hashem. That is the mercy. That is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. But how could it be? If things get more difficult, how could it be? Midas HaRachmim. So the simple understanding is that there's a question which is asked in last week's parsha. It says, "Vayemoru chayim." Vayemoru es chayim. What do we eat moror at the Seder? And when we had the Beis Hamikdash in the Korban Pesach, moror was a doraisa. To eat moror with the Korban Pesach and the matzah was a Torah obligation. Today, the moror that we have in the Korban Pesach is only rabbinical. And what is it? To commemorate the Vayemoru chayim, to commemorate how they embittered our lives. But the commemoration of the embitterment of our lives at the time of the Beis Hamikdash was a doraisa. Now, what we call the Tamei HaMikro, the calculations on the words, which is the tune, that when you say the word Vayemoru chayim, what should have been what we call in Yiddish the trop, the Tamei HaMikro, the cantillation. It should have been something which indicated pain. But yet, the cantillation of Vayemoru es chayim is Kadma v'Azlo. Kadma v'Azlo. So the difference between the Vilna Gaon says something phenomenal. In Hebrew, what does Kadma v'Azlo mean? Kadma in Aramaic. Kadma v'Azlo. Earlier, we're going to go out. Kadma, Kodem, Azlo is Holech. We're going to go out earlier. Initially, we were meant to be in Egypt 400 years. Even though we calculate the time from the birth of Yitzchak, that's only to work out the numbers. But in reality, we should have been in Egypt for 400 years. Why were there only 210? Because if we would have been there longer, we would have gone into the oblivion. So Hashem had to take us out after 210 years. But factually speaking, that 210 years had to have some semblance of 400 years. So what did Hashem do? He intensified the bondage, That initially they weren't supposed to suffer to that degree, but since they had a semblance that qualitatively it had to be the equivalent of quantitative 400 years, so he intensified the bondage. That's the embitterment of the lives. So the Vilna Gaon says that's Tone of Moshe. Why did we go out after 210 and not the full 400? Hodem Aslo, because Vayimaru Chayim. That's the Vilna Gaon. The cancellation reveals why we went out early. Chassam Sofer says, he says just the tune. The tune is a tune of ecstasy. It's ecstasy. We're going out. The tune, Kadma v'azlo, is Kadma v'azlo. We're going out, we're leaving 190 years before we're supposed to leave. So therefore, the intensification of the bondage, it's like, you're paying off the last debt to the bank. The last payment, you're going to burn the mortgage. You got to pay your last dues, and before you pay your last dues, now you're going out. Therefore, V'yom Hashem, Elokim Ani Hashem, what you understand it to be Midas Adin is Midas Arachmim. That I'm turning the screws and causing more pain just for the moment, that's all indication it's coming to an end. That's how Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains this. As a result of that, it is Ani Hashem. So the Orach Chaim HaKadosh quotes the Gemara above Basra. We find that the end of every season is always, there's an intensification of that season. The Gemara says the end of summer is the hottest part of summer. The end of winter is the coldest part of winter. Why? So he says the way Hashem created the world, whenever there's a change, there's always a resistance to the change. And after, when the resistance intensifies, it breaks. The change happens. The end of winter comes, spring's about to come. So there's an intensification. It's like winter puts in its heels, not to let go. And then it dissipates and spring comes. Summer's about this. There's going to be this transition from summer to spring, summer to fall, the same thing. The Gemara says the darkest part of night is the moment before dawn. That's the darkest part of the night. Because as the transition from night to day comes, there's intensification of the nighttime. Before Gula comes, the process of redemption comes, there's an intensification of bondage, and as a result of that intensification, therefore, it became more embittered. They withdrew the straw subsidy, but this is Ani Hashem. The Chofetz Chaim writes that he said, Shiva was visited the Chofetz Chaim a number of years before he passed away, so he was there, Shal L'Shudas. Chofetz Chaim was known, he had Ruach HaKodesh. He was divinely inspired. And during Shal L'Shudas, he put his head down and he started to cry. And he said, World War I devastated all the Jewish communities in Europe. There was a level of suffering not to be believed. But he said that what's coming up, there's going to be another war. World War I is going to be child's play compared to World War II in terms of the suffering. But he said the consolation is, this is Ikvus Mashiach. This is the last payment. This is the World War II is the paying the last dues before Mashiach comes. That's what Chofetz Chaim said about World War II. Didn't mean immediately afterwards, but that's part of the last payment. So therefore, that's the consolation. Despite we don't understand why we have to suffer to that degree, but whenever there's going to be a transition to Gula, which is the old Gula, is coming Mashiach, therefore there's going to be that level of suffering. That's what Chofetz Chaim said. But that's how the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains why before things got better, which is the beginning of the plagues, did things have to get worse, and that's why the straw subsidy was withdrawn. There's a Maral. Now Miriam was the oldest child of Amram and Yocheved. Miriam, why was she named Miriam? The reason why she was named Miriam, because Miriam means morim, bitter. Because when the Egyptians, they started to intensify the Shibud, the bondage, she was born at that time. So to indicate the time when she was born, that things got extremely painful and the suffering was overwhelming, Miriam was called Miriam from the word morin. Mar is bitter. She represented the embitterment of the Jewish people. Miriam, the Maral of Prague explains, says something phenomenal. The Gemara tells us in Tainus that there were three exceptional leaders that were given to the Jewish people. Shlosha Parnosim Tovim. Who are they? Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. They were the three leaders that were given to the Jewish people. And each one, the merit of Miriam, we had the wellspring in the desert, the merit of Aaron, we had the clouds of glory. In the merit of Moshe, we had the Mon. These were the three exceptional leaders. So Miriam, being born, she was going to be one of the people to be the leaders to bring the Jews out of bondage into redemption. Within nature, when Miriam was born, there was already a sense. This was already the beginning of the transitional process, Miriam being born. So because she was born within nature, where God created the world, when there's going to be a transition, right away, the bondage puts in its heels. Therefore, the embitterment started when Miriam was born, because she was the first sign, trace that ultimately what's going to happen in the future. Therefore, Miriam was Vayimaru Chayim. Therefore, she was called Miriam from the word Morim. That's the Maral of Prague. Torah tells us that a child does not suffer for the sins of the parents. Does not suffer for the sins of the parents. I mean, Avram sins, and we pay the price. It seems to be it's not in accordance with the principle of lo yumsa obas bonim lo yumsa obas. Children don't pay for the sins of the parents, right? But yet it's explicit. We went to Egypt because of the chet, the sin of Avram Avinu. How do we understand it? So we once spoke about this. When a parent brings a child into life, into existence, if the child is as errant as the parent, the child will pay for the sins of the parent. But if the child does not in any way behave like the parent's negative record has nothing to do with the child. Let's say you have a genetic defect in the parent's genealogy, right? In his whatever, in the genome. That defect will manifest itself in the children. Avram Avinu is the foundation, is the founding patriarch of the Jewish people. He asked an inappropriate question. That inappropriate question was a defect in his spirituality. That now we descend from him, through Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they carry that defective gene. That defective spiritual gene, they carry it. Avram, we fathered the 12 tribes, it was passed on to all 12 of them. That gene somehow has to be repaired, has to be purged from our genetic profile. What did that? So therefore, we needed the bondage of Egypt to make the repair on that defective gene. So when we go to Sinai, whatever that gene, that defective gene was, we're rid of it, and now our genetic profile is perfect, other than the Chet of Adam Rishon. The sin of Adam Rishon is separate. But in terms of what Avram being the founding father, that had to be corrected. Therefore, we had to suffer. Once we have Klal Yisrael, the parents have nothing to do with the children. In terms of the children have to pay the debt of the parents, definitely not. So that's what we had to. So that suffering. So now, once we suffered, that baggage were released, but we don't believe. The process cost us our belief. We became pagans. God says there's a 10-month rejuvenation process by being revealed to being exposed to revealed miracles, which are undeniably the hand of Hashem. You're going to be restored. I once mentioned Beis Halevi. We find the portion of Bishalach. Vahi Bishal Paro Sa'om, when Paro sent out the people. So the Midrash, there's a Yalkut. In Hebrew, the word Vai means woe. Vai. So the Midrash says, Vai Vayhi b'shalach, vay shesholach. God says, woe to me that I had to send out the Jews after 10 plagues. I wish I could have kept them there longer, that the Egyptians should have suffered more plagues. So the Beis Halevi asks, David Melech says in Tehillim, Rachma v'kol masov, God's mercy is upon all his creation. What do you mean? He wishes he could have kept them longer, so he could have punished the Egyptians to a greater degree. So he explains that every Makkah had a dual purpose. It was punishing the Egyptians, but every time we saw, again, the hand of God revealed in the most obvious way, which was undeniably, the hand of Hashem, it expunged us from that evil or that misbelief, that misconception of reality. We saw the hand of Hashem. So every Makkah we were exposed to, we were elevated, our faith in God and belief in God strengthened. When we left, we weren't fully purged. We still there was a certain degree of possible doubt, although we believed. Even at Kriyas Yamsuf, it says, "V'ayimid b'Hashem Moshe Abdo," but there was a microscopic cell of Avodah Zarah in us, and that's why the Chet Egel happened. The only reason why we were susceptible to the introduction of the Egel by the Erev, by the rabble, is because there was still a trace of the Avodah Zarah, of the idolatry, which came about due to the bondage. So the Egyptians were culpable for that. So what Hashem says, "Vay b'shalach," woe to me, I had to send it out earlier, meaning if we had to go out earlier, of course, we would have gone into the oblivion. We had to go out then. God had no choice. Had no choice. We had to leave that, because otherwise we would have gone into the oblivion. However, God says, but woe to me, I wish I could have kept there longer, because if they would have seen more of my hand, they would have totally, fully purged of that idolatrous belief. The Egel would have never happened. That's the value. So deal with two things. There's paying the debt, and where are you at? The plagues brought us to a level of clarity, belief in God. But it was only the 10 plagues, even though the more, we speak about how many plagues took place in Egypt. Was each plague 4 plagues, 5 plagues? Were there 50 makos, right? Were there 40 makos? That's we discussed in the Agora, right? An argument among the Tanoim. Rekiva says each plague was 5. So if it was 5, and we speak about 10, it's 50, and the hand, it's 5 times 50, it's 250. That's how many nisim, that's how many makos took place at the Yam Suf. The Egyptians experienced 250 levels of plague, and we witnessed that, because that was needed still to purge us, to bring us another level. For that reason.
Rabbi, what